I don't think I'll ever experience cold the same way again. It's not just the temperature that makes my skin crawl now. It's the memory of what happened that night, deep in the woods of Vermont. This happened 3 years ago, during a winter trip with my two best friends, Nick and Jordan. We had rented an isolated cabin for a weekend of snowboarding, drinking, and just getting away from the stress of daily life. The idea was to enjoy the quiet, away from everything. But in hindsight, I think we were being watched from the moment we arrived. The first night was fine. A little eerie, sure. The cabin was old, and the howling wind outside made it feel like something was whispering against the windows. But it was the second night when things turned wrong. We had spent the day on the slopes, exhausted ourselves, and come back to the cabin to relax. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, melting away the chill that had settled in our bones. Snow was falling heavily outside, covering the landscape in a suffocating white silence. Jordan had just gone to bed while Nick and I stayed up playing cards. I don't remember the exact time, but it was late, probably around 2 a.m., when the first strange thing happened. A soft thump came from outside. Nick and I froze, staring at each other. It was a solid, deliberate sound, like something heavy had landed in the snow just beyond the cabin walls. I got up, walked to the window, and peered outside. The porch light barely illuminated the yard beyond, but I could see something. A single set of footprints in the snow, leading from the dense woods directly toward the cabin. The prints stopped about 10 feet away from the porch. I scanned the tree line, my breath fogging up the cold glass. Nothing. No movement. No signs of life. Just the tracks appearing out of nowhere, stopping right there. What the hell? Nick muttered from behind me. We stood there for a long moment before Nick grabbed the flashlight from the counter and flicked it on. He shined it outside, the beams sweeping over the empty yard. We waited, listened. Silence. After a few minutes, we laughed it off. Probably some animal, we figured. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. We shut the curtains, locked the door, and went to bed. But sleep never came. At some point in the night, I woke up. A noise had pulled me from my sleep. A scraping sound. Slow. Deliberate. Like something was dragging across the wooden walls of the cabin. I lay frozen in my bed, my heart hammering. It was right outside. The sound moved, starting from one side of the cabin and making its way around. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. A knocking sound, impossibly soft. Tap, tap, tap. Then a whisper. I swear to God, I heard it, low and raspy, like something struggling to mimic a human voice. Let me in. I shot up in bed, my blood running cold. For a few minutes, I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, suddenly, Nick's voice called out from the other room. Dude, do you hear that? I bolted out of bed and met him in the hallway. His face was pale, his eyes wide. Someone's outside. Another soft tap, tap, tap against the glass. We turned our heads at the same time. The window. We could barely see through the frosted glass, but there was a shadow, a figure standing just outside. Neither of us moved. We just stood there, barely blinking, staring at that unmoving silhouette. Then, as if it knew we were watching, it shifted. It leaned closer. The window didn't fog up. No breath. No warmth. Just the slow drag of something sharp against the glass. Nick grabbed the fire poker, and I reached for the closest thing I could, a heavy flashlight. My hands were shaking. Should we wake Jordan? I whispered. Nick didn't answer because, at that exact moment, the figure outside vanished. Gone. No movement. No sound. Just an empty, snow-covered yard. We stood there for a long time before finally creeping back to bed, but neither of us slept. And then, at around 4 a.m., the power went out. The temperature dropped fast. Without the heater running, the cabin turned ice cold within minutes. Nick and I grabbed extra blankets, shivering in silence. Then we heard the door. Click. Our heads snapped toward the front entrance. It was locked. We had checked it twice before going to bed. Another click. The sound of the lock turning. Nick grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. It's unlocking itself, he whispered. I jumped up, running to the door, and threw my weight against it just as it pushed inward. Something was on the other side. Pushing. Trying to get in. I shoved harder, my breath coming out in fast, terrified bursts. Help me. Nick scrambled over, throwing his body against the door. The pressure against us stopped immediately. We didn't move, didn't breathe. We just listened. Then, from the other side of the door, came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A deep, slow exhale, like something had been waiting for us to let go. I reached up with trembling hands and turned the deadbolt. Locked. We didn't speak. We just backed away. Then footsteps. Not from outside. From inside. Slow. Deliberate. From the hallway. My blood turned to ice. Jordan's room. Nick grabbed the fire poker again, and we crept down the hall. The door to Jordan's room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Jordan was gone. His bed was a mess, the blankets half on the floor. The window was wide open, snow blowing in. And then we saw them. The footprints, leading from the bed to the window, and then disappearing into the woods. We ran outside, screaming his name, but the storm had swallowed everything. The snow fell too heavily. The tracks faded too fast. He was gone. We searched for hours, calling his phone, our voices hoarse. Nothing. Just silence. By morning, we called the police. A search team was sent out. They found nothing. No signs of struggle. No clues. Just those impossible footprints leading away from the cabin into the frozen trees. Jordan was never found. I don't go near forests in winter anymore. The worst part, the part one never told anyone, when we stood in Jordan's empty room that night, staring at that open window, Nick whispered something that made my stomach drop. The footprints, he said, voice shaking. They don't start at the door. I frowned. What? They start at the bed. And then it hit me. Jordan hadn't walked outside. Something had been in the room with him, lying in his bed, waiting. I've always loved winter. The quiet stillness of snowfall, the way the world feels muted under a blanket of white, it's peaceful. Or at least, that's what I used to think. But after what happened to me last year, winter will never feel the same again. I know how this sounds, but I swear to you, something unnatural lives in the cold. And it watches. This isn't some ghost story or urban legend. It happened to me, alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. And to this day, I don't know what I encountered that night, only that I barely made it out alive. It started as a solo getaway. I had been dealing with some stress at work, and my girlfriend had just broken up with me. I needed to clear my head. A friend of mine, Jason, had a family cabin up north, deep in the Adirondacks. He offered it to me for the weekend. No cell service, no internet, just total solitude. The cabin was isolated. We're talking miles from the nearest road, accessible only by snowmobile. But that's what I wanted. A break from everything. The first day was fine. The snowfall was heavy but beautiful, and I spent most of the day reading by the fireplace, sipping whiskey, and enjoying the quiet. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped drastically, and the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin creak. I wasn't worried. Old cabins make noises. But then, around midnight, I heard something that didn't sound like the wind. A knock. I froze. It was light, rhythmic. 3 slow taps on the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one should have been out there. The snow was nearly 2 feet deep. Who would be walking in that in the middle of the night? I waited, my breath held. Then another 3 knocks. Tap, tap, tap. My stomach twisted. I slowly approached the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. Just darkness and the swirling snow. I wasn't about to open the door. Instead, I turned off the inside lights, grabbed a flashlight, and shined it through the window. The beam illuminated the snow-covered porch. Empty. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Footprints, leading up to the door, but none leading away. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just ice falling from the roof or a tree branch knocking against the cabin. I double-checked the locks, made sure the fire was strong, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I kept feeling something outside. Watching. Waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off, but a noise jerked me awake. It wasn't the knocking this time. It was the sound of something moving. Inside, I barely breathed. The fire had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. I listened, my ears straining over the sound of the wind. Then, from the living room, a whisper. It was so faint I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, low, almost breathless. "Let me in." I shot up, my body locking in fear. The voice was inside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly got out of bed, every nerve in my body screaming. I crept toward the doorway, my breath coming in short gasps. The living room was empty, but the front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I shut it, bolted it, and backed away, my skin ice cold. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe the door hadn't latched all the way. But then I heard it again, whispering, coming from the window. I turned slowly, and I saw it. A face. Not human. It was pressed against the glass, its skin stretched too tight, its eyes black pits. It had no breath. No fog on the window. Just a gaping, silent grin. I sprinted for my bag, grabbed my keys, and threw on my boots without even tying them. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I yanked the door open and ran into the storm. The snow was brutal, cutting at my face, the wind deafening. I didn't look back. I reached my snowmobile, nearly slipping as I jumped on. My fingers fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life. And then, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, twisting around, nothing was there. But the footprints in the snow told me otherwise. They were everywhere, surrounding me, circling the cabin. And they weren't deep, like normal footprints in heavy snow. They were just on the surface, like whoever, or whatever, made them wasn't heavy enough to break through. I gunned the throttle, tearing through the storm, not stopping, not looking back. The wind carried something behind me. Laughter. I didn't stop riding until I reached my truck, miles away. I threw everything inside and drove until I hit the nearest town. I checked into a motel, locked the doors, and sat in the shower for over an hour, just letting the hot water burn away the cold. The next day, I called Jason and told him what happened. He listened quietly, then said something that made my stomach drop. "You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't answer. Jason sighed. "You're not the first." I demanded he explain, and after a long pause, he did. His grandfather had built that cabin decades ago, but they had stopped using it. Not because of maintenance, not because of money, but because of whatever was out there. His grandfather called it the Thin One, a thing that moved with the wind, that whispered in the dark, that left footprints where it shouldn't have been able to walk. And once you saw it, it didn't forget you. I never went back. To this day, sometimes in winter, when the snow is falling heavy and the world goes quiet, I swear I hear it. A whisper. "Let me in." Winter has a way of making the world feel empty. I've always thought there was something eerie about the stillness of a snow-covered forest, the way the trees stand frozen in time, the way the silence seems too absolute, like something is listening. Last winter, I learned that sometimes something is, and it never really leaves. I was house-sitting for my uncle, deep in the forests of Montana. He owns a cabin there, about 20 miles from the nearest town, isolated in a way that feels almost unnatural. The perfect getaway, if you don't mind being completely alone. I didn't. Or at least, I thought I didn't. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fireplace, read a book, and listened to the wind battering the trees outside. The snowstorm was heavier than expected, but the cabin was stocked, and I had everything I needed. At around midnight, I stepped outside to grab firewood. The cold hit me like a wall, and the snow had already piled up several inches. As I stacked logs into my arms, I glanced up at the trees. Something about them felt off, like the darkness between them was deeper than it should be. Like something was standing there, watching. I shook it off and went back inside, bolting the door behind me. I told myself it was just the loneliness getting to me, but I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, the storm had worsened. The windows were completely frosted over, and when I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising, but still unsettling. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the snow pile up outside. Then I noticed something. Footprints, leading from the treeline to the front door. My stomach tightened. I knew for a fact that I hadn't left those. I pulled on my coat and boots, stepping outside cautiously. The prints were deep, partially filled with fresh snow, meaning they were made recently. But here's what made my blood run cold. There were no tracks leading away. Whoever had walked up to my cabin had never left. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there, just the silent, swaying trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I went back inside and locked the door. The rest of the day was uneventful. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the wind, maybe an animal, though deep down I knew better. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it. A soft tapping at the window. My breath caught in my throat. It was too slow, too rhythmic to be tree branches. I turned my head, heart pounding. Nothing. Just the swirling snow outside. I exhaled shakily, but then, bang. A single, heavy knock on the door. My entire body locked up. I sat frozen, my mind racing. No one should be out here. No one could be out here. Bang. Bang. Louder this time. I forced myself to stand. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, slowly pulling it aside. The porch light flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. But beyond the glow, just darkness. I held my breath. Then something moved. A shape, just beyond the edge of the light. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. Then it took a step forward. I slammed the curtain shut. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears. I backed away, reaching for my phone. Still no signal. No way to call for help. For the next hour, I sat in silence, the fire crackling beside me, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. I told myself I had imagined it, that the wind was playing tricks on me. But when I finally built up the courage to check the window again, the footprints were gone, as if they had never been there. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sent my nerves into overdrive. But eventually, exhaustion won. I woke up to an eerie silence. No wind, no movement. Just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and that's when I noticed. The door was unlocked. My stomach dropped. I was sure, absolutely sure, I had locked it. I slowly stepped out of bed, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was ice cold. And then, I saw them. Wet footprints. Inside the cabin, leading from the door. Stopping just beside my bed. My entire body went rigid. My eyes darted around the room. Someone had been inside, watching me. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my pulse hammering. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. But the footprints. They were still there. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and threw on my coat. I had to dig out my truck. It had been buried under at least 2 feet of snow. But I didn't care. I needed to get out. As I turned onto the narrow road leading back to town, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And I saw it. A figure. Standing in the middle of the road. Watching me. Its head tilted. Its arms too long for its body. I stepped on the gas. My tires skidded on the ice, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. By the time I reached town, the sun was rising. I checked into the first motel I found and locked the door behind me. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me. But that morning, as I went to grab breakfast, I overheard an old man at the diner talking to a younger couple. They had mentioned something about the thing in the woods. I froze, listening. He spoke in hushed tones, said there had always been something out there, that sometimes people saw footprints leading to their homes, that sometimes people would wake up to their doors unlocked, and those who stayed too long were never found. I left town that afternoon and never went back. But even now, in the dead of winter, when the snow is thick and the nights are silent, I can't help but feel like it's still out there, watching, waiting, and one day it might come back. Winter is supposed to be peaceful. The quiet snowfall, the soft glow of streetlights on fresh powder, it should feel safe. But last year, I learned something about the winter. Something watches from the storm. And if you see it, it sees you too. I live in a small town in Colorado, a place where winters are brutal and snowfall can trap you indoors for days. It was mid-January, and a blizzard had been raging for nearly 12 hours. The news warned people to stay inside, and I was more than happy to do so. I live alone in a small house just outside of town. It's not completely isolated. There are a few neighbors nearby, but with the storm raging outside, the world felt deserted. That night, I was sitting in my living room, bundled up in a blanket, watching an old horror movie. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The power had flickered a few times, but held steady. Then, at around 11:30 p.m., my doorbell rang. I froze. No one should have been outside in that storm. I hesitated before getting up. My house has a small porch, and the exterior light barely illuminated the yard beyond it. When I peeked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. There was someone standing there. A man bundled up in a heavy coat, his hood pulled low. His back was slightly turned, as if he wasn't sure whether to knock again. I hesitated before unlocking the door, but didn't open it fully. "Hello." My voice felt small over the wind. The man didn't respond at first. Then, without turning to face me, he said, "Can I come in?" His voice was flat, emotionless. A deep sense of unease crawled up my spine. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Still, he didn't turn. "I need to come inside," he repeated, his voice the same hollow monotone. Something was wrong. The way he stood, the way he spoke, it wasn't normal. I tightened my grip on the door. "I can call for help if you need it, but I can't let you in." Silence. Then slowly, he turned his head toward me. Not his whole body, just his head. His hood cast his face in shadow, but I could see enough. His mouth was open too wide, stretching in a way that wasn't human. His skin, what little I could see, was a sickly, frostbitten gray. And his eyes. There were no eyes, just empty black holes. I slammed the door and locked it. My breathing was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stepped away, expecting to hear pounding, scratching, some attempt to get inside. But there was nothing, not a single sound. Slowly, I crept back to the peephole. The porch was empty. He was gone, but the snow on the porch was undisturbed, like no one had ever been there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed locked in my bedroom, listening. The wind howled, the storm raged on. But inside the house, everything was silent. The next morning, the blizzard had passed. The sky was a bright, empty blue, and the snow was piled nearly waist-high. I stepped outside cautiously, looking for any sign of footprints. There were none. I convinced myself it had been a dream, stress, something explainable. But I couldn't shake the fear that something had been there. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. It was almost 2 a.m. when I woke up, heart pounding. I wasn't sure why at first, then I realized. The wind had stopped. It was completely, unnaturally silent. And then, tap. A single, light tap on my bedroom window. I didn't move. My window was on the second floor. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass. And I saw it. A face, pressed against the window. The same wide mouth, the same empty, black pits where eyes should have been. Only now the mouth was moving. It was whispering something. I couldn't hear it, but I could see its lips forming words over and over. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." I bolted out of bed, grabbing the first thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp. My hands were shaking as I backed toward the door. And then, the whispering stopped. I dared to look again. The window was empty, but the frost on the glass, there were handprints, still fresh, and they were on the inside. I didn't stay in the house after that. I packed a bag, got in my truck, and drove straight to my brother's place in town. I told him I had a pipe burst, needed somewhere to stay. I couldn't bring myself to explain the truth. That night, I barely slept, but just before dawn, I woke up suddenly. And I heard it, a voice outside the window, whispering. I forced myself to look, and in the snow outside, I saw the footprints, leading from the woods, stopping just outside the glass. The next morning, I finally told my brother everything. He listened, eyes wide with disbelief, but he didn't laugh. He didn't call me crazy. Instead, he told me something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't the first. Other people in town, they had seen it too. A figure appearing in the storm, standing outside their homes, knocking, whispering, and the ones who let it in, they were never seen again. I never went back to that house. I sold it, moved to a different town entirely. But every winter, when the snow starts falling and the wind howls outside my window, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the white void of a blizzard, it's still watching, and it's still looking for a way inside. Winter has a way of distorting reality. The thick snowfall muffles sound, The wind howls in ways that make you hear things that aren't there, and the endless white outside can play tricks on your mind. But sometimes the tricks aren't in your mind. Sometimes something else is out there, waiting for you to notice it. I know this because last winter I saw it, and I wish to God I hadn't. I live in northern Montana, just outside a small town where everyone knows everyone. Winters here are brutal, and last December, we got hit with one of the worst blizzards in years. The roads were buried under 5 feet of snow, and most people, myself included, were snowed in for days. I work remotely, so being stuck at home wasn't a huge issue. My house is small but cozy, surrounded by a dense forest. For the first couple of days, everything was fine. The blizzard raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, but I had food, power, and a fireplace to keep me warm. Then, on the third night, something strange happened. At around midnight, I was watching TV when I heard it. A knock, faint, deliberate, coming from my back door. Now, my back door leads to the woods. No paths, no driveways, just trees stretching for miles. I muted the TV and listened. Another knock. 3 slow, rhythmic taps. I hesitated before standing up, my heartbeat already picking up. My back door has a small window, but it was covered in frost. I approached cautiously and wiped it with my sleeve. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the blizzard outside, the snow whipping past the trees. Then my stomach dropped. There were footprints, leading up to the door. I live alone. No one should have been out there. I turned on the porch light, but the second I did, the knocking stopped. I waited, breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just the wind. I slowly unlocked the door, only opening it a crack. The cold blasted in, making me shiver. I looked around, my eyes scanning the empty forest. Nobody was there. But the footprints, they didn't lead away, only to the door. I slammed it shut and locked it. I barely slept that night, my ears straining to hear any sound over the storm. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but when I stepped outside, I saw them again. The footprints were still there. Only now they were closer to the window. That night, I barricaded the doors. I shut all the blinds, turned off most of the lights, and kept my phone beside me. But at exactly 2:47 a.m., I woke up. I don't know what woke me at first. Maybe instinct, maybe some barely audible noise. And then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound, coming from the roof. I went completely still. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something was moving up there. Then a soft tap at my bedroom window. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look. And I saw it. A face. Not human. Pressed against the glass. It had no hair, no lips, just a stretched grayish face. Its mouth was too wide, its teeth small and uneven, like shattered glass. And its eyes, sunken black pits, were staring straight at me. My body locked up in pure terror. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched me. Then, it smiled. Not a natural smile. This thing had too many teeth. It grinned, slow and deliberate, as if it knew how terrified I was. I lunged for the lamp on my nightstand, knocking it over in my panic. When I looked back, it was gone, but there was something on the window. Not frost. A handprint. From inside the glass. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bathroom with the door locked. By morning, I was done. I packed a bag, threw on my coat, and dug my truck out of the snow. I didn't care about the storm. I needed to get the hell out of there. But when I stepped outside, I froze. There were footprints everywhere, all around my house, leading to every window, every door. And they weren't mine. I practically sprinted to my truck. I climbed in, slammed the door, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Still nothing. My breath came in short gasps, fogging up the windshield. Then, I saw it, standing at the tree line. Tall, thin, its head cocked slightly to the side, watching me. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. And then, it started walking toward me. Not running, not lunging, just a slow, deliberate stride, like it had all the time in the world. I kept turning the key, whispering, "Please, please start." It was halfway across the yard now. Closer, closer. Then, the engine roared to life. I floored it, tires spinning in the snow. I didn't even look back. I drove straight to my friend Ethan's house in town. When I got there, I was shaking so badly I could barely talk. Ethan took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him everything. The knocking, the face, the footprints. He didn't laugh. Instead, his face went pale. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. 2 years ago, an old man had lived in my house before me. A recluse kept to himself. One winter, during a bad storm, he went missing. They found his footprints leading out into the woods. But they never found his body. Just his face. Torn off. Frozen to the glass of his bedroom window. I never went back. I hired a moving company to clear out my house. Told them to leave anything they didn't want to take. I moved to a different state. Somewhere warm, where it never snows. But every now and then, in the middle of the night, I still hear it. The soft, deliberate knocking. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that smile,